Term limits in the United States apply to many offices at both the federal and state level, and date back to the American Revolution. Term limits, also referred to as rotation in office, restrict the number of terms of office an officeholder may hold. Historical background. Pre-Constitution term limits date back to the American Revolution, and prior to that to the democracies and republics of antiquity. The Council of 500 in ancient Athens rotated its entire membership annually, as did the F48 in ancient Sparta. The ancient Roman Republic featured a system of elected magistrates, tribunes of the plebs, aediles, quaestors, praetors, and consuls, who served a single term of 1 year, with re-election to the same magistracy forbidden for 10 years. According to historian Garrett Fagan, office holding in the Roman Republic was based on limited tenure of office, which ensured that authority circulated frequently, helping to prevent corruption. An additional benefit of the cursus honorum run of officers was to bring the most experienced politicians to the upper echelons of power holding. In the ancient republic, many of the founders of the United States were educated in the classics, and quite familiar with rotation in office during antiquity. The debates of the day reveal a desire to study and profit from the object lessons offered by ancient democracy. Prior to independence, several colonies had already experimented with term limits. The Fundamental Orders of Connecticut of 1639, for example, prohibited the colonial governor from serving consecutive terms, setting terms at 1 year's length, and holding that no person be chosen governor above once in 2 years. Shortly after independence, the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776 set maximum service in the Pennsylvania General Assembly at 4 years in 7. Benjamin Franklin's influence is seen not only in that he chaired the Constitutional Convention which drafted the Pennsylvania Constitution, but also because it included, virtually unchanged, Franklin's earlier proposals on executive rotation. Pennsylvania's plural executive was composed of 12 citizens elected for the term of 3 years, followed by a mandatory vacation of 4 years. The Articles of Confederation, adopted in 1781, established term limits for the delegates to the Continental Congress, mandating in Article 5 that no person shall be capable of being a delegate for more than 3 years in any term of 6 years. On October 2, 1789, the Continental Congress appointed a committee of 13 to examine forms of government for the impending union of the states. Among the proposals was that from the state of Virginia, written by Thomas Jefferson, urging a limitation of tenure, to prevent every danger which might arise to American freedom by continuing too long in office the members of the Continental Congress. The committee made recommendations which, as regards congressional term limits, were incorporated unchanged into the Articles of Confederation. The fifth article stated that no person shall be capable of being a delegate for more than 3 years in any term of 6 years. Term limits in the Constitution. In contrast to the Articles of Confederation, the Federal Constitution Convention at Philadelphia omitted mandatory term limits from the Second National Frame of Government, i.e., the U.S. Constitution of 1789 to the present. However, George Washington set the informal precedent for a 2-term limit for the presidency, a tradition that prevailed until Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, after which the 22nd Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified in 1951, formally establishing in law the 2-term limit. However, when the states ratified the Constitution, several leading statesmen regarded the lack of mandatory limits to tenure as a dangerous defect, especially, they thought, as regards the presidency and the Senate. Richard Henry Lee viewed the absence of legal limits to tenure, together with certain other features of the Constitution, seen as most highly and dangerously oligarchic. Both Jefferson and George Mason advised limits on re-election to the Senate and to the presidency, because, said Mason, nothing is so essential to the preservation of a Republican government as a periodic rotation. The historian Mercy Otis Warren warned that there is no provision for a rotation, nor anything to prevent the perpetuity of office in the same hands for life, which by a little well-timed bribery will probably be done. 19th century. The fact that perpetuity in office was not approached until the 20th century is due in part to the influence of rotation in office as a popular 19th century concept. Ideas are, in truth, forces, and rotation in office enjoyed such normative support, especially at the local level, that it altered political reality. For a detailed study of the 19th century concepts of rotation, consult Political Science Quarterly, Volume 94, House Turnover and the Principle of Rotation, by Robert Struble, Jr. See also his treatise on 12 Lights, Chapter 6, Rotation in History. Consult also James Young's The Washington Community, 1800 to 1828. According to Young, the tendency to look with mistrust upon political power was so ingrained into American culture that even the officeholders themselves perceived their occupations in a disparaging light. James Fenimore Cooper described the common view that contact with the affairs of state is one of the most corrupting of the influences to which men are exposed. An article in the Richmond Inquirer noted that the long-cherished principle of rotation in office had been impressed on the Republican mind by a kind of intuitive impulse, unassailable to argument or authority. Beginning about the 1830s, Jacksonian democracy introduced a less idealistic twist to the practice of limiting terms. Rotation in office came to mean taking turns in the distribution of political prizes. Rotation of nominations to the U.S. House of Representatives. The prizes became a key element of payoffs to the party faithful. The leading lights in the local party machinery came to regard a nomination for the House as salary for political services rendered. A new code of political ethics evolved based on the proposition that turnabout is fair play. In short, rotation of nominations was intertwined with the spoils system. In district nominating conventions, local leaders could negotiate and enforce agreements to pass the nominations around among themselves. Abraham Lincoln was elected to the United States House of Representatives in 1846 under such a bargain, and he returned home to Springfield after a single congressional term because, he wrote, to enter myself as a competitor of another, or to authorize anyone so to enter me, is what my word and honor forbid. During the Civil War, the Confederate States Constitution limited its president to a single 6-year term. Era of incumbency. The practice of nomination rotation for the House of Representatives began to decline after the Civil War. It took a generation or so before the direct primary system, civil service reforms, and the ethic of professionalism worked to eliminate rotation in office as a common political practice. By the turn of the 20th century, the era of incumbency was coming into full swing. A total of 8 presidents served 2 full terms and declined a third, and 3 presidents served 1 full term and refused a second. After World War II, however, an officeholder class had developed to the point that congressional tenure rivaled that of the U.S. Supreme Court, where tenure is for life. Term limits movement. Homesteading, or securing a lifelong career in Congress, was made possible by re-election rates that approached 100% by the end of the 20th century. The concept of homesteading brought about a popular movement known as the term limits movement. The elections of 1990 to 94 saw the adoption of term limits for state legislatures in almost every state where citizens had the power of the initiative. In addition, 23 states limited service in the delegation to Congress. As they pertain to Congress, these laws are no longer enforceable. However, as in 1995, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned congressional term limits in U.S. Term Limits, Inc. v. Thornton, ruling that state governments cannot limit the terms of members of the national government. Where rotation in the legislative branch has withstood court challenges, term limits continue to garner popular support. As of 2002, the advocacy group U.S. Term Limits found that in the 17 states where state legislators served in rotation, public support for term limits ranged from 60 to 78%. Federal term limits. As of 2013, term limits at the federal level are restricted to the executive branch and some agencies. Judicial appointments at the federal level are made for life, and not subject to election at term limits. The U.S. Congress remains without electoral limits. President. America's first president, George Washington, started the tradition of informal presidential term limits by refusing to run for a third term. The short-lived Confederate States of America adopted a 6-year term for their president and vice president and barred the president from seeking re-election. That innovation was endorsed by many American politicians after the American Civil War, most notably by Rutherford B. Hayes in his inaugural address. Franklin D. Roosevelt was the first and only American president to break Washington's tradition successfully. He died in office a few months after starting his fourth term. This gave rise to a successful move in Congress to formalize the traditional two-term limit by amending the U.S. Constitution. As ratified in 1951, the 22nd Amendment provides that no person shall be elected to the office of president more than twice. Congress reformers during the early 1990s used the initiative and referendum to put congressional term limits on the ballot in 24 states. Voters in 8 of these states approved the congressional term limits by an average electoral margin of 2 to 1. It was an open question whether states had the constitutional authority to enact these limits. In May 1995, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled 5-4 in U.S. Term Limits, Inc. v. Thornton, 514 U.S. 779, that states cannot impose term limits upon the federal representatives or senators. In the 1994 elections, part of the Republican platform included legislation for term limits in Congress. After winning the majority, a Republican congressman brought a constitutional amendment to the House floor that proposed limiting members of the Senate to 2 6-year terms, and members of the House to 6 2-year terms. However, this rate of rotation was so slow that the congressional version of term limits garnered little support among the populist backers of term limits, including U.S. Term Limits, the largest private organization pushing for congressional term limits. The bill got only a bare majority, falling short of the two-thirds majority needed for constitutional amendments. 3 other term limit amendment bills failed to get more than 200 votes. Defeated in Congress and overridden by the Supreme Court, the federal term limit uprising was brought to a halt. The term limits intended simultaneously to reform state legislatures remain in force, however, in 15 states. In 2007, Larry J. Ssolbergj revived the debate over term limits by arguing in A More Perfect Constitution that the success and popularity of term limits at the state level suggests that they should be adopted at the federal level as well. He specifically put forth the idea of congressional term limits and suggested a National Constitutional Convention be used to accomplish the amendment, since the Congress would be unlikely to propose and adopt any amendment that limits its own power. Some state legislators have also expressed their opinions on term limits. It is confirmed that in the following 5 states, and there may be others, state lawmakers approve resolutions asking Congress to propose a federal constitutional amendment to limit the number of terms which members of Congress may serve. South Dakota legislature approved in 1989. South Dakota House Joint Resolution Number 1001. Hawaii Senate approved in 1990. Hawaii Senate Resolution Number 41. Unicameral only. It took 8 years for this resolution to find its way into the congressional record and to be correctly referred to the Committee on the Judiciary, and even then, its text was not provided in the congressional record. Back in 1990, Hawaii's S.R. number 41 was indeed received by the U.S. House of Representatives, and was designated as Memorial 416, but the resolution was erroneously referred to the Committee on Energy and Commerce, and its text is not provided in the congressional record. Utah legislature approved in 1990. Utah Senate Joint Resolution Number 24. It took 4 years for this resolution to find its way into the U.S. Senate's portion of the congressional record. Idaho legislature approved in 1992. Idaho Senate Joint Memorial No. 116, and Florida legislature approved in 2012. Florida House Memorial No. 83. Taking matters a bit further, on February 10, 2016, Florida lawmakers approve House Memorial No. 417 calling upon Congress, pursuant to Article 5 of the Federal Constitution, to assemble a convention to prepare a constitutional amendment that would establish term limits upon members of Congress. Supreme Court. Legal scholars have discussed whether or not to impose term limits on the Supreme Court of the United States. Currently, Supreme Court justices are appointed for life during good behavior. A sentiment has developed among certain scholars that the Supreme Court may not be accountable in a way that is most in line with the spirit of checks and balances. Equally, scholars have argued that life tenure has taken on a new meaning in a modern context. Changes in medical care have markedly raised life expectancy and therefore has allowed justices to serve for longer than ever before. Stephen G. Calabresi and James Lindgren, professors of law at Northwestern University, argued that, because vacancies in the court are occurring with less frequency and justices served on average between 1971 and 2006 for 26.1 years, the efficacy of the democratic check that the appointment process provides on the court's membership is reduced. There have been several similar proposals to implement term limits for the nation's highest court, including Professor of Law at Duke University, Paul Carrington's 2005, the Supreme Court Renewal Act of 2005. Many of the proposals center around a term limit for justices that would be 18 years. The proposed staggered term limits of 18 years would, according to Calabresi, Lindgren, and Carrington, allow for a new appointment to the court every 2 years, which in effect would allow every president at least 2 appointments. Professor Carrington has argued that such a measure would not require a constitutional amendment, as the Constitution doesn't even mention life tenure. It merely requires that justices serve during good behavior. The idea was not without support among judges, as John Roberts supported term limits before he was appointed to the Supreme Court as Chief Justice. Calabresi, Lindgren, and Carrington have also proposed that when justices have served out the proposed 18-year term, they should be able to sit on other federal courts until retirement, death, or removal. Fairleigh Dickinson University's Public Mind poll measured American voters' attitudes towards various proposed Supreme Court reforms, including implementing term limits. The 2010 poll found that a majority of Americans were largely unaware of a proposal to impose a term limit of 18 years, as 82% reported they had heard little or nothing at all. Notwithstanding a lack of awareness, 52% of Americans approved of limiting terms to 18 years, while 35% disapproved. When asked how old is too old for a Supreme Court judge to serve if he or she seems healthy, 48% said no limit as long as he or she is healthy, while 31% agreed that anyone over the age of 70 is too old. Some state lawmakers have officially expressed to Congress a desire for a federal constitutional amendment to limit terms of Supreme Court justices, as well as of judges of federal courts below the Supreme Court level. While there might be others, below are three known examples. In 1957, the Alabama legislature adopted Senate Joint Resolution No. 47 on the subject. In 1978, the Tennessee General Assembly adopted House Joint Resolution No. 21 on the subject, and, in 1998, the Louisiana House of Representatives adopted House Resolution No. 120 on the subject. State term limits. Term limits for state officials have existed since colonial times. The Pennsylvania Charter of Liberties of 1682, and the Colonial Frame of Government of the same year, both authored by William Penn, provided for triennial rotation of the provincial council, the upper house of the colonial legislature. The Delaware Constitution of 1776 limited the governor to a single 3-year term. Currently, the governor of Delaware can serve 2 4-year terms. At present, 36 states have term limits of various types for the governors. To circumvent the term limit in Alabama, incumbent Governor George Wallace pushed through the nomination of his wife Laleen in the 1966 Democratic primary, which was, in those days, the real contest in Alabama. It was generally understood that Mrs. Wallace would only be a titular governor while her husband continued to hold the real power. She won the election, but only served 17 months before dying in 1968. As indicated above, in 15 state legislatures the members serve in rotation, i.e. under term limits enacted during the reforms of the early 1990s. In another 6 states, however, state legislatures have either overturned their own limits or state Supreme Courts have ruled such limits unconstitutional. In 2002, the Idaho legislature became the first legislature of its kind to repeal its own term limits, enacted by a public vote in 1994, ostensibly because it applied to local officials along with the legislature. Gubernatorial term limits. Governors of 36 states and 4 territories are subject to various term limits, while the governors of 14 states, Puerto Rico, and the mayor of Washington, D.C., may serve an unlimited number of times. Each state's gubernatorial term limits are prescribed by its state constitution, with the exception of Wyoming, whose limits are found in its statutes. Territorial term limits are prescribed by its constitution in the Northern Mariana Islands, the Organic Acts in Guam and the U.S. Virgin Islands, and by statute in American Samoa. Unique in its restriction, Virginia prohibits its governors from succeeding themselves, although former governors are re-eligible after 4 years out of office. Many other states formerly had this prohibition, but all had eliminated it by 2000. The governors of the following states and territories are limited to 2 consecutive terms, but are re-eligible after 4 years out of office: Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Colorado, Florida, Georgia, Hawaii, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maine, Maryland, Nebraska, New Jersey, New Mexico, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, South Carolina, South Dakota, Tennessee, West Virginia, American Samoa, Guam, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Equivalently, the governors of Indiana and Oregon are limited to serving 8 out of any 12 years. Conversely, the governors of Montana and Wyoming are restricted to 2 terms, limited to serving 8 out of any 16 years. Finally, the governors of the following states and territory are absolutely limited to 2 terms: Arkansas, California, Delaware, Michigan, Mississippi, Missouri, Nevada, the Northern Mariana Islands, and Oklahoma. The current governor of California is, however, serving a 4th term because his first 2 terms were before limits were passed in California, and the limits did not apply to individuals' prior terms. The governors of New Hampshire and Vermont may serve unlimited 2-year terms. The chief executives in the following states, district, and territory may serve unlimited 4-year terms: Connecticut, Idaho, Illinois, Iowa, Massachusetts, Minnesota, New York, North Dakota, Texas, Utah, Washington, Wisconsin, District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico. The governor of Utah was formerly limited to serving 3 terms, but all term limit laws have since been repealed by the legislature. State legislatures with term limits: the following 15 legislatures have term limits: Arizona legislature, 4 consecutive 2-year terms for both houses. No limit on total number of terms. Arkansas General Assembly, 16 years total in either the House or the Senate, and 2 4-year terms for Senate members applied. California State Legislature, 12 years total in either Assembly or Senate, of either 3 2-year terms for Assembly members and 2 4-year terms for Senate members apply. Colorado General Assembly, 4 consecutive 2-year terms in the House and 2 consecutive 4-year terms in the Senate. Florida Legislature, may serve no more than 8 consecutive years in either House. No limit on total number of terms. Louisiana State Legislature, 3 consecutive 4-year terms for both houses. Maine Legislature, 4 2-year terms for both houses. No limit on total number of terms. Michigan Legislature, 3 2-year terms for House members and 2 4-year terms for Senate members. Missouri General Assembly, 4 consecutive 2-year terms for House members and 2 4-year consecutive terms for Senate members. Members may be elected again to the other House but not serve more than 16 years. Montana State Legislature, 4 2-year terms for House members in any 16-year period and 2 4-year terms for Senate members in any 16-year period. Nebraska Legislature, unicameral legislature, members limited to 2 consecutive 4-year terms, after which they must wait 4 years before running again. Nevada Legislature, 6 2-year terms for Assembly members and 3 4-year terms for Senate members. Ohio General Assembly, 4 consecutive 2-year terms for House members and 2 consecutive 4-year terms for Senate members. Oklahoma Legislature, 6 2-year terms for House members and 3 4-year terms for Senate members. Once term limited in one House, a legislator cannot be elected to the other. South Dakota Legislature, 4 consecutive 2-year terms for both houses. overturned or repealed state legislative term limits. The following 6 legislatures have had the term limits nullified. Idaho Legislature. The legislature repealed its own term limits in 2002. Massachusetts General Court. The Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court overturned term limits in 1997. Oregon Legislative Assembly. The Oregon Supreme Court ruled term limits unconstitutional in 2002. See term limits in Oregon. Utah State Legislature. The legislature repealed its own term limits in 2003. Washington State Legislature. The Washington Supreme Court voided term limits in 1998. Wyoming Legislature. The Wyoming Supreme Court ruled term limits unconstitutional in 2004. See term limits in Wyoming.